They didn't use a blade. They didn't drag him before a crowd. They stacked stones over a doorway, one by one, and walked away. No trial. No sentence read aloud. No final words. Just the slow scrape of masonry sealing over the entrance while a man stood inside, breathing air that was already running out. And here's what makes it worse. He could hear them out there, working without urgency, without hesitation. His own mother walked up, set a stone in place, and left without a word. That man had once commanded every Greek soldier on the field at Plataea. He broke the Persian invasion. He saved the civilization that was now burying him alive. His name was Pausanias, and the distance between savior of Greece and a body pulled from a sealed temple turns out to be shorter than anyone in Sparta wanted to admit. But to understand how that distance collapsed, you have to go back to where it started. 479 BC. The largest land army Persia had ever assembled was spread across the plains of Boeotia, north of Athens. Mardonius, Xerxes' handpicked general, his cousin by marriage, one of the original architects of the invasion, commanded somewhere around 100,000 men. Cavalry, infantry, archers pulled from every corner of the empire. Across the field, the Greek coalition was already falling apart before a single weapon was raised. City-states that had pledged soldiers were pulling back. Supply lines were thinning. Commanders from different cities were arguing over positioning, over water access, over who would hold the most exposed wing. The kind of chaos that destroys alliances before the fighting even begins. And holding all of it together, standing at the center of that fracturing alliance, was Pausanias. Not a king. Technically. A regent, ruling in place of Pleistarchus, the young son of Leonidas, the man who had died at Thermopylae 3 years earlier. Every order Pausanias gave carried the shadow of that legacy. Every Greek soldier on the field knew whose seat he was keeping warm. What most accounts miss about Plataea is how close it came to being a catastrophe. Mardonius had spent days working the Greek lines. His cavalry cut off the army's water supply at the Gargathian spring. The Greeks were forced into a nighttime withdrawal, one of the most dangerous maneuvers an ancient army could attempt. Units separated. The Athenians drifted too far east. The Spartans ended up isolated on a ridge near Plataea itself, exposed and massively outnumbered. Mardonius saw it and moved. He sent the full weight of his infantry straight at the Spartan position. What happened next would define Pausanias for the rest of his life, and ultimately destroy him. The Spartans held. Not because the plan was perfect. It wasn't. Not because the terrain favored them. It didn't. They held because Pausanias refused to give the order to charge until the sacrificial omens were right. His men were standing in arrow fire, shields splintering around them, and he stood there waiting. When he finally gave the command, the Spartan line hit the Persian infantry with enough force to kill Mardonius in the fighting. His personal guard, the elite 1,000, shattered around him. And with their general dead, the Persian army came apart from the center outward. By the end of the day, the invasion of Greece was finished. Pausanias had done something almost no one in Greek history had managed before. He held a multi-city coalition together against internal collapse and delivered a decisive victory against the largest empire in the world. That kind of achievement changes a man, especially one who was never meant to be more than a temporary stand-in. The Greek alliance didn't dissolve immediately after Plataea. Persian garrisons still controlled islands across the Aegean. Strategic positions needed securing. And Pausanias was the one they sent. Cyprus fell. Then Byzantium, the gateway between Europe and Asia, a city sitting on top of the Black Sea grain routes. Whoever controlled Byzantium held leverage over half the Greek world. Pausanias held Byzantium. And that's where the first reports started coming back to Sparta. Not treason, not yet. Something quieter, and in Sparta, arguably worse. He was changing. Persian robes appeared. A personal guard of hired men replaced Spartan soldiers around him. Banquets replaced communal mess halls. He carried himself differently, moved through rooms differently, issued commands in a style that looked nothing like anything Sparta had ever produced. Allied cities began sending complaints, not about military failure, but about arrogance, about a commander who was starting to look less like a Spartan regent and more like the Persian administrators they had just finished removing from power. Most accounts stop there and call it corruption, call it a man broken by success. But there's a detail that rarely gets mentioned. In Byzantium, Pausanias took custody of several high-ranking Persian prisoners. Nobles, relatives of powerful satraps, men worth enormous ransoms or significant political leverage. Then those prisoners disappeared. Released quietly, no ransom collected, no record of any negotiated exchange. Pausanias said it was a miscommunication with the garrison. Nobody believed him, because the only person who gained anything from releasing Persian nobles back to the empire was someone who wanted the empire to owe him something in return. The question that began circulating through Sparta's ruling council was straightforward. What exactly did Pausanias expect to get back? That question would take years to answer. And when it finally did, the answer arrived in the hands of a man who was never supposed to read it. Sparta's response was measured. No army, no public accusation. Just a single message, as was their custom, ordering Pausanias home. And he came. That surprised people. A man with his own fleet, his own garrison, control of one of the most valuable cities in the Mediterranean, and he simply returned when summoned. Maybe he thought he could explain it away. Maybe he believed they had nothing concrete. Or maybe, as some ancient sources suggest, he thought Plataea still protected him. He was half right. The ephors, the 5 annually elected officials with oversight power even over kings, put him on trial. The charges were broad. Misconduct, overreach, behavior unbecoming a Spartan commander. Nothing held. The released prisoners were suspicious, but suspicion isn't a verdict. The Allied complaints were damaging, but they came from Ionians, and Sparta didn't give much weight to Ionian opinions on anything. He was acquitted. But they didn't send him back to Byzantium. They stripped his command. Naval operations passed to Athens, and then later to Simon, son of Miltiades. This was the moment that handed Athens control of what would eventually become the Delian League, an Athenian empire in everything but name. Pausanias lost his position, his fleet, and Byzantium. Then, without authorization, he went back anyway. He got hold of a single trireme, sailed to the Hellespont, set himself up at a city called Colone on the Troad coast, and started running independent operations. His own campaigns, his own contacts, his own correspondence. Sparta sent another message, sharper this time. Return now, or be declared an enemy of the state. He came back again. Still composed, still apparently untouched. But this time something followed him home. A trail of information that had nothing to do with Persian robes or missing prisoners. This trail connected Pausanias to something that, if accurate, made his dealings with Persia look almost minor. Pausanias was allegedly negotiating with the Helots. If that name doesn't land with the weight it should, consider what it meant. Sparta's entire civilization was built on a foundation of forced labor. The Helots, a subjugated population descended largely from the original inhabitants of Laconia and Messenia, outnumbered Spartan citizens by margins ancient sources estimated at anywhere from 7 to 1 up to 20 to 1. They worked the land, produced the food, carried supplies during campaigns. They were never free, never citizens, never anything other than property held in place by organized violence. Sparta's greatest fear, the thing that shaped its entire military culture and social structure, was a Helot uprising. The Crypteia, Sparta's secret police, existed specifically to identify and eliminate potential Helot leaders before any organized resistance could form. Now consider what a single rumor could do. Pausanias is promising the Helots their freedom. It didn't matter whether it was true. The accusation alone was seismic, because if Pausanias, a regent, a member of the Agiad royal house, a man with connections deep inside Sparta's military establishment, had even suggested offering Helot emancipation in exchange for their support in some kind of power play, then Sparta wasn't dealing with a rogue general anymore. They were dealing with a threat to the entire structure of their civilization. This is where the ancient sources diverge. Thucydides and Plutarch don't fully agree on how much of the Helot conspiracy was real and how much was built by Pausanias' enemies. Thucydides treats it almost as established fact. Plutarch is more cautious. What's clear is that the ephors now held 2 threads simultaneously. The Persian negotiations, still without hard proof, and the Helot conspiracy, terrifying but equally unverified. Either one alone was enough to watch him carefully. Together they turned Pausanias into the most dangerous man in Sparta. But watching wasn't sufficient. They needed something they could hold. And then a messenger walked through the gates carrying exactly that. Pausanias had been using personal couriers to communicate with Artabazus, a Persian satrap serving as the intermediary between the Greek regent and the court of Xerxes. These weren't official dispatches. They were private letters, carried by men Pausanias selected himself. Men loyal to him rather than to Sparta. The system worked until one particular messenger noticed a pattern. None of the previous couriers had come back. Every man sent to deliver a letter to Artabazus had vanished without a return message, without reassignment, without any trace at all. Before he left, he opened the letter. Inside was what the ephors had been looking for. Pausanias was writing directly to Xerxes' representatives, offering to deliver Greece under Persian authority. In exchange, he wanted a position of power, possibly marriage into the Persian royal family. And at the bottom of the letter, a final instruction. Once delivery was complete, the messenger was to be killed. He was carrying his own death warrant. He turned around and brought the letter to the ephors. This should have ended it immediately. A letter in Pausanias' own hand, outlining negotiations with the empire that had tried to burn Athens to ash less than a decade earlier. But the ephors hesitated, and the reason tells you something important about how Sparta actually worked beneath its image of absolute discipline. Pausanias was still a member of the royal house. He had still won Plataea. Moving against him publicly on the strength of a single letter, carried by a man with his own possible motives, carried risks the ephors weren't willing to absorb without more certainty. So instead of arresting him, they built a trap. The messenger would return to Pausanias. He would express fear, confusion, distress about what he'd read in the letter. He would press for reassurance. And while they spoke, the ephors would be listening. They concealed themselves near the meeting point, close enough to hear every word. The messenger played it exactly right. He confronted Pausanias, showed him the opened letter, told him what he'd read, said he was afraid. And Pausanias, rather than denying the letter or claiming it had been forged, confirmed everything. He didn't shout, didn't threaten. According to Thucydides, he tried to calm the messenger, reassured him, promised his safety, and asked him to proceed with the delivery as planned. Every word reached the ears of the men hidden in the dark. But even then, they didn't move on him that night. They withdrew, reconvened, and debated. Because in Sparta, acting against a man of Pausanias' standing required not just evidence, but political consensus, and certainty that the fallout could be managed. By the time they finally moved, Pausanias had sensed something had shifted. He ran. Not far. There was nowhere to go. Sparta had no harbor to disappear into, no foreign quarter, no allied faction willing to shelter a man accused of conspiring with Persia and agitating the Helots. So he ran to the one place where the rules changed. The temple of Athena Chalkioikos, Athena of the Bronze House, on the Spartan Acropolis. Sacred ground. In Greek religious law, anyone who entered a temple and claimed divine protection became a suppliant. Killing a suppliant within a sacred precinct was sacrilege, a pollution that didn't just offend the gods but infected the entire community. Plagues, crop failures, military defeat. The Greeks didn't treat divine pollution as symbolic. They understood it as direct consequence. Pausanias knew this. The ephors knew it too. So they stopped at the entrance. For a moment, there was a standoff. Pausanias inside. The ephors outside, armed with legitimate authority but held back by a religious prohibition they couldn't override without consequences none of them wanted. They couldn't enter. They couldn't drag him out. So they did something else. They removed the roof. Piece by piece, they stripped the timber and tiles from above, exposing the interior to open sky. The reasoning was precise. They weren't entering sacred space. They weren't spilling blood on holy ground. They were simply reducing the quality of the shelter. Then they started on the entrance. Stone after stone, they sealed the doorway shut. And the man who had held the line at Plataea, who had watched the Persian Empire collapse against Spartan shields, stood inside a holy building and watched the light shrink to a crack, then to nothing. One detail survives across multiple sources and remains difficult to explain away. As the entrance was being sealed, an old woman approached. Pausanias' mother. The sources don't all agree on her name, and some don't name her at all. What they record is what she did. She didn't speak to him. She didn't beg for mercy on his behalf. She didn't try to stop the ephors. She picked up a stone, carried it to the entrance, set it in place, and left. After that, whatever hesitation remained among the onlookers was gone. If his own mother had made her judgment known, there was nothing left to argue about. The wall closed completely. No food passed through. No water. No communication. The ancient sources say they waited not hours but days, until the sounds from inside finally stopped, until there was only silence behind the stone. Then they opened a section of the wall, just enough to remove what was inside. One account says he was barely alive when they reached him, dying within moments of being exposed to open air. Others say he was already gone. Either way, they pulled him out, and then they sealed the temple again as though nothing had happened. In Sparta, the calculus was simple. The threat had been identified, cornered, and removed without a single drop of blood on consecrated ground. The religious prohibition had been technically observed. The political problem had been neutralized. The helots had lost their alleged champion. Efficient, contained, clean. Except it wasn't. Almost immediately, things began to go wrong. The oracle at Delphi, the most authoritative religious voice in the Greek world, declared that Sparta had incurred divine pollution. Not for the execution itself, but for the manner of it. For allowing a suppliant to die within sacred space, regardless of the legal reasoning they had used to justify it. The gods, it turned out, had no interest in loopholes. Sparta was ordered to make atonement. The form that atonement took is worth sitting with. They commissioned 2 bronze statues and placed them in or near the temple precinct. Multiple sources indicate these statues were meant to represent Pausanias himself, a memorial to the man they had just sealed inside a building and left to die. The same state that removed the roof and stacked the stones erected statues in his honor. Not because they reconsidered what he'd done, but because the cost of how they handled it turned out to be higher than anyone had calculated. If you're still watching, make sure you're subscribed to Crimson Archive and hit the like button. It genuinely helps bring more stories like this one to people who'd want to hear them.